Nine o'clock here on your Wednesday evening, March 1st, and thanks for being with us as we recap what happened in the courtroom today in the Alec Murdaugh double murder trial. The disgraced former attorney accused of shooting and killing his wife and son in June of 2021. Now, in a few moments, we're going to be joined by criminal defense attorneys Brian and Luke Sheely for their take on the state's closing arguments today and the jury's trip to the scene of the murders. And that's where we began. Jurors actually starting the day with a trip to the former Murdaugh property estate known as Moselle to look at the property and the scene of the crimes. They left the courthouse about 9:10 this morning. Vans with tinted windows took the jury about 30 minutes from the courthouse in Walterboro to the Murdaugh home. The judge allowed them to see the area around the dog kennels where the killings took place and the outside of the family's home. The visit lasted about an hour or so, and then jurors also appeared to examine the woods across the street from the property. Jurors didn't hear testimony during the visit, and they could only ask questions to Judge Newman. No one has lived on the 1,700-acre property since the murders. After the jurors returned to the courthouse, it was time for closing arguments. Judge Newman had hoped both sides would be able to deliver their closing today, and he would instruct the jury before the end of the day. But like many parts of this trial, things took a little longer than planned. Only lead prosecutor Creighton Waters was able to deliver his side's closing arguments today. He spoke for more than 3 hours this afternoon, and he talked about the circumstantial evidence that he says proves Murdaugh murdered his wife Maggie and son Paul.
There is only one person who had the motive, who had the means, who had the opportunity to commit these crimes, and also whose guilty conduct after these crimes betrays him. Ultimately stole about $4.5 million between the Satterfields and others, and unlike other cases, Tony Satterfield, who was the son of his longtime housekeeper, he took all the money, took every bit of it. And that was coming to a head as we move into the spring of 2021, because there had been some publicity, and you heard from Tony Satterfield that he was the defendant reached out in the spring of 2021 because there had been publicity and saying, hey, I'm still working on the case, everything's fine, I'm still working on the case, it's good. But the reality is the defendant didn't have that money. This is Alec, the prosecutor, the lawyer, and he's thinking through this. He's thought through this. He's going to use two guns because it's going to confuse people that perhaps there were two shooters. But again, it doesn't make sense. Two family weapons? You heard that Maggie had no defensive wounds. You also heard Paul had stippling from that first shot, a close range shot, with no indication that he detected a threat from the person who fired that weapon. And why? Because it was him. Same with Maggie, because Maggie sees what happens and she comes running over there, running to her baby. Probably the last thing on her mind, thinking that it was him who had done this, she's running to her baby while he's picked up the blackout and opens fire at close range, again with no defensive wounds. They didn't have this kennel video until April of 2022, when Paul's phone was finally unlocked. And that changed everything. Why did it change everything? Opportunity. Being at the scene of the crime when the murders occurred. Opportunity. And more importantly, exposing the defendant's lies about the most important thing he could have told law enforcement. When was the last time I saw my wife and child alive? Why in the world would an innocent, reasonable father and husband lie about that after hearing multiple individuals of his family and friends and law partners get on the stand and listen to that video and say, that's him on that video, got on the stand for the first time and said, okay, I was there. He was forced into doing what he does all the time, and that's coming up with a new lie when he's confronted with evidence he can no longer deny. At 9:08:36, he's right here doing 42 miles an hour, and there's Maggie's phone location. And at 9:08:42, he's just past it. And at 9:08:58, just 20 seconds after he's almost at that location, he texts Maggie's phone and says, "Going to check on him, be right back." He arrives at the kennels, and 10:06:14 is the 911 call. Now, there's a lot of back and forth with him about that, but in his statements, with what he told his law partners that he went in great detail over about his activities that night, including lying to them about ever going to the kennels, he was very clear that he got out of the car and went and checked Paul and Maggie. One time he said to see if they're breathing, another time to check a pulse. You've seen the horrific injuries they'd suffered. 19 seconds. Is that enough time for a surprised human being to come across that scene, process what they are seeing? Get out of the car. Go over there. Check both those bodies and then call 911. He's changed the story now yet again because he's confronted with this evidence. This defendant, on the other hand, has fooled everyone who thought they were close to him, everyone who thought they knew he was who he was. He's fooled them all. And he fooled Maggie and Paul too. And they paid for it with their lives. Don't let him fool you too.
Sometimes where he's just
All right, we're being joined now by Brian and Luke Shealy, our criminal defense attorneys. You were watching that video as he was looking at the jury. What were you saying?
Well, I hope that tomorrow we see from John Metters, perhaps at the final closing. He's brought on this case for a reason. He's done a lot of murder trials. I would describe him as a heavy piece of closing artillery that's just right there at their disposal, and he can really bring a dramatic flair and emotion that I don't think Waters is really his strength. His strengths are facts and retaining that and regurgitating that. So I could see Metters was anxious to be involved today.
We'll get back to what was said in court in just a moment. First, let's begin with how the day started, and that was the jury trip to Moselle, the former Murdaugh property where the murders took place. Some fresh video coming after the jury was there today. The judge did allow some media on the property, some pool footage, so we're seeing some new footage today that we have not seen before. Brian, let me get your take on what happened with this visit today. It seemed like we had some very curious jury members out there, didn't we?
Yeah, and from a defense perspective, that's why the defense team made the request for them to be allowed to go out there. They want them looking at details. They want them, and again, Judge Newman has instructed them, you're not to start deliberation. So any requests by the jurors are their own internal curiosities. They're not collaborating about what pieces of the property to look. They're not really debating anything at this point. I just feel after such a long trial, going out in the fresh air, getting out of the courthouse, seeing what everyone's been talking about live and in person would be so meaningful for the jurors. I've been hearing a lot of the jurors are maybe bundled up or, have got various stages of tension during this trial. So this is a great opportunity to snap them awake before, especially closing arguments. And I did learn today from the reporter pool that they were observing some of the jurors asked to stop across the street from the kennel entrance to the property. So there's two entrances, one main gate and one towards the kennel, and they were seeking to go across the street into the wood line, and they were walking out in the wood line, and no one really seems to know what they were looking for. And the only thing that I would think is that they were very interested in what line of sight would be from across the street and what you could see to the kennel. So if you are to potentially believe Alex Murdaugh's theory that somebody would have been, unassociated with him, would have been lying in wait to kill his family for whatever reason, and they did it as soon as he left the property, that would be where you'd want to look. You'd want to see what you could see. Can you see the kennel? Can you see when Alex Murdaugh potentially would be leaving? So the fact that they looked at that either tells me they're trying to rule it in or completely rule that out. So that was intriguing for me, at least.
Luke, Creighton Waters talked about that dog kennel video, and he talked about the dog kennels in general today during his closing arguments. They didn't recover the footage off of Paul's phone until April of 2022, and that's when he told the jury today everything changed with that day. When they got the dog kennel video, everything changed. So how important was it for the jury to actually be on site and to see the dog kennel itself out there today?
Very important. It is a defense request, but it is the singular piece of smoking gun type evidence that the state has simply to show that he lied. He lied right away to responding officers. He lied again and repeatedly that he wasn't down there, and he had to do a lot of explaining on that. And so it shows just minutes before their deaths what was going on, what was the dynamic. Hear his voice when he says he wasn't down there. So, on the one hand, it's a defense motion to get them there, but on the other hand, they can kind of feel, well, I'm going to look into this cage where Cash was, and I want to think about where Mr. Murdaugh was when Paul is taking this video. And so the more they think about the video, the better as far as Creighton Waters is concerned.
Now, Creighton Waters today hammering home the fact that Alex Murdaugh admits to lying over and over and over and over. He said in court today that he lies easily and convincingly, and that he's good, really good at it. Again, Brian, he's hammering this home to the jury today. So he's lying to you with all this other stuff. How can you believe him now when he says, I didn't do this?
Exactly. I mean, that is a major hallmark of the state's prosecution of this case, demonstrating that he's a liar through his financial crimes, demonstrating that he would lie right out the gates to SLED the night of about not, when's the last time you saw your family? And really tying in the lies. I thought it was pretty clever by Creighton Waters by saying, listen, he's a former prosecutor. He's a trial lawyer. He can produce emotions and look a jury in the eye because that's what he's trained to do. And as a former prosecutor, he knows what evidence he needs to be aware of in constructing a murder. And he lies easily and convincingly. And so when you say things like that, and for Creighton Waters' perspective, he's been saying that throughout the case. He especially laid down the law on the cross-examination of Alex Murdaugh. He said, you lie easily and convincingly to these jurors. Mm-hmm. And so expect John Metters to be, and he was taking notes throughout Creighton's first closing today, and good closing team trial lawyers. Luke and I do this all the time in our closings. We will echo each other from what one person says in an opening statement or closing, because you want to be reverberating the point with the jurors, and they will remember that sentiment. And I think it was very effective today.
An appeal to the jury today by Creighton Waters to use their common sense here, Luke, saying, well, we've got them on video. We've got them talking at like 8:45. We believe these murders happened around 8:49 to 8:53, somewhere in that time frame. So appealing to the jury, saying, use your common sense here. If things happen the way he said they happened, he took one of the shortest naps in history before he got into his vehicle and he left the property later that evening.
Right. I mean, being that it is a circumstantial case, and you heard Creighton Waters kind of be defensive. Now, that doesn't mean it's not equally good evidence, but you don't have an eyewitness saying, I watched him do it. You don't have a gun with his fingerprints all over it that matches. So you basically have to say, look at your timeline, use your common sense. Who else could it be? And I thought it was pretty effective where you have that one slide where you've got the kind of undisputed times of the kennel video, and then he used Alex Murdaugh's own testimony against him to say, okay, you testified that it took about a minute to get the chicken out of Bubba's mouth. So, all right, let's put you to You know, 8:47. You testify that you hung around for a couple more minutes before saying bye. All right, let's get you to 8:49. So he's really using his own words against him, trying to, in the totality of the circumstances, say, well, who else could it be? The question is that enough? I expect we'll hear some fireworks from Jim Griffin tomorrow, but that's really what the case is all about. Who else could it be? Plus, what the state would assert is a motive to distract from an impending financial disclosure and doom.
Creighton Waters also bringing up the fact that no blood was found, no blood of any significance found on Alec Murdaugh. He said he could have easily stripped down and washed himself at the dog kennels. He showed photographs to the jury today of the puddles that were on the ground, basically saying, well, this is why. This is how he has no blood on him, because he turned the hose on. He washed himself down before he got into his vehicle. An important point to make, Brian?
I think it's a point that he has to try to bring out, because Jim Griffin tomorrow is going to say, listen, there's no blood. He's innocent of this crime. This, we've heard both sides, both experts concerning the crime scene would say there would be blood spatter. There would be a lot of, material coming, off these victims. And I think that's what he has to do. Now, whether that's enough, I don't know. There's been some refuting of that due to the rainy conditions, due to the hose already being out in some earlier videos. So I think he has to do that to explain how clean, I think I've said this here on this program before, the state, if he was fully bloody, they'd be saying, that's great evidence. But he's clean, well, that's great evidence too. So it's very important. He can't not address it, JR, or else he'll get hammered tomorrow by Jim Griffin. Mm-hmm. So he did what he had to do.
He talked about who was shot and killed first. He told jurors it was Paul who got shot. He said Murdaugh perhaps, saying that Murdaugh, he says, pulled the trigger, and says Murdaugh was perhaps surprised to see him come walking through the doorway, so he had to shoot him again, this time the fatal blow to the head. Then he says Maggie comes running, my baby, my baby. When he says stuff like that, and again, we don't know what Maggie Murdaugh said that night, but she's running toward her baby, according to Creighton Waters. Is that just playing to the women who are on the jury today?
I think he's doing what he can with the evidence. The evidence is never going to match up 100% for him. The concept that he went down there with a shotgun and a Blackout 300 and first shot Paul across the chest, thinking that the chest shot would do it, but Paul is still advancing him. And what he said today was that perhaps Mr. Murdaugh was resting the shotgun down in preparation to move to the Blackout, saw Paul still advancing, so he shot it from very much an awkward kind of resting position, because that is what the angle is. And if it's the state's theory, it's a 45-degree angle with no stippling to the shoulder, so you know it's 2.5 to 3 feet away, which really puts the butt of that traditional hunting rifle in the ground. He's trying to explain that because he wants to get ahead of Jim Griffin. Whether a mom would run towards her son who's just been annihilated by a husband, or whether she would run for the hills, it's hard to say. It's fight or flight. So he's doing what he has to do with the evidence and trying to discredit what the defense has been trying to do with the evidence.
He also told the jury today that Murdaugh planned this out by using two weapons to confuse people into thinking there were two shooters, Brian, something the defense has been bringing up.
Well, obviously he has to do that because ballistically we know there are two firearms. We know there's a 300 style Blackout. We have a very strong assumption that it's a family weapon that's gone missing. We've got the shotgun certainty with Paul. He does try to make the point. So to get away from the two-shooter concept, he says, well, listen, Alex Murdaugh, the former prosecutor, the smart and savvy trial lawyer, the easy and convincing liar to people, the financial crimes liar, the guy that has no soul, as he steals from his clients that are critically injured in these cases for all these years, was a master manipulator, and that he went down with two guns purposefully to shoot Paul with one and to shoot Maggie with another because he's just that good. I think Creighton Waters has to do that, JR, but for me, if I'm Jim Griffin, I'm saying, well, listen, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't be this sloppy financial criminal where you've got checks floating out of books that the paralegal can find. You've got law partners finding lots of financial scribblings on your desk. You're not, I mean, as soon as someone looks into the financials, it's easily apparent that he's stealing massive amounts of money. So, in one hand, he's a very sloppy financial criminal, not very savvy there, but he's like the most masterful deceiver of law enforcement on the annihilation of his family. If I were Jim Griffin, I'd be saying that does not play. That is reasonable doubt, but it is something that the state, and we heard Alan Wilson kind of say it for the first time in his examination of Kinsley, it's always been the state's theory that there were 2 guns, and so, but not 2 shooters. So they just got to deal with it and hope that the overwhelming evidence with the timeline, especially with the lies right out the gate, is enough to convince the jury.
So Creighton Waters started his closing arguments right after noon today. He wrapped it up about 4:45. He didn't go 4 hours and 45 minutes, but we, by our calculation, right at 3 hours or so today. Just right, or too long, or not enough?
Too long. Just because you have, let's say, a 3-week trial doesn't mean you need a 3-hour closing, because there's only so much attention span that a jury has. And Creighton, he's got a lot of talents, and one of those talents is organizing information in a way that can be digested, but it has been presented and digested over these 5 weeks. He felt the need to present every piece of evidence that he felt was important, which was a lot. You really want to weave your top things into a powerful, resonating, emotional, tugging at the heartstrings and sympathies of that jury, and leave it there, because you start to lose them. I mean, I was studying this. I knew I was going to talk to you about it. Mm-hmm. And you lost me, and I know I'm paying attention, so it was probably a couple hours too long. But he had a lot of information he felt he needed to get out. I don't think we're going to see that. And I think we'll see John Metters tomorrow. I don't think we're going to see that length. Typically, when you open on the law, which is what Creighton did, the defense then goes, and then the closer for the prosecution kind of closes on the facts. Well, Creighton closed on all the facts and the law. So John Metters is going to be keen into responding specifically to what the defense has said. There's no way we're going to see that kind of length, but we are going to see a lot of emotion and drama to really bring it home for the prosecution.
Brian, do you agree there that perhaps we could have had closing arguments a little tighter today, a little shorter?
I do, and I feel like Creighton Waters, he would be the prosecutor not only on the double murder, but he would be the main prosecutor for the financial crimes, and he has that knowledge base. And I was talking to Luke about it when he was typing up his PowerPoint, and I'm a big fan of visual aids during closing. I think it's helpful. It's just like going out to the scene. It kind of gets the jurors' attention, so they would have been focusing on the PowerPoint. But I think, Creighton, like Luke said, he seems quite brilliant, but he overplayed his hand. Because they were allowed to get in everything. He really talked about every detail of every financial crime. I think it would have been more effective, JR, if he had said, listen, you're reasonable people, you're smart people, you've been paying attention all week, you're doing a good job, I commend you for this. I'm not going to go into the details of all the financials. I'm going to name the victims and tell you how he lied convincingly and easily, but I trust you recall all that. Let's focus on the murder. I think he would have kind of risen to a higher status in front of that jury. I think doing a 3+ hour closing, knowing that his partner, John Metters, is going to close again as a cleanup closer, was too much. And so I think Creighton maybe got ahead of himself a little bit, and maybe it was an unforced error. But as prosecutors that do major cases like this, a lot of the really, really, really good ones understand the value of not overdoing it in closing, because it's kind of you lose the jury in a certain point, and so it is hard to be concise. And in a complex case, it can be difficult. But I do feel he went an hour too long, JR.
All right. Waters telling the jury that Murdaugh had motive, means, opportunity, and that the evidence is there right in front of the jury. All right. So defense team, they get their shot at 9:30 in the morning. We heard them say in court today they thought they would go about 2 hours or so. What do we expect to hear from the defense tomorrow to counter what they heard today from the prosecution?
You're going to hear them try to empower the jury to focus only on what's before them, which in their mind is the murder case. It's not the financial case. They will probably say there was a place and time for that. They will infer that, Alex Murdaugh, he confessed to those crimes. He's not. If you acquit him, he is not going home, ladies and gentlemen. To try to make them feel better about that decision, and then they will say he loved his family. You saw real emotions. You saw real tears. Even all the state witnesses said he loved his family. The finances are not a motive. Yes, he had his demons. He had his baggage. He is an opioid user, but he loved that family. He did the best he could. And use your common sense. You will hear that refrain again, and he'll talk about no smoking gun. You'll talk about no, reasonable inferences from the timeline. You'll hear about the cell phones and whether he's manufacturing an alibi or just calling everybody like he always does while flying up the road to see his family. I would like to think you'll hear about perhaps lies to the grand jury by the lead investigator, blood spatter that was referred to that never came into evidence. And you'll hear about the weight of their own experts to say, this is why it's two shooters. This is why he's too tall to realistically be a shooter. And kind of, they will, the state has done a good job. The best thing Waters did today was say, look, all that emotional head rocking that you saw that we've seen a bunch, he's doing that right there as he lies to SLED in his car. That's his tell for when he's lying. And the defense will say, that's not his tell. Anytime he thinks about something stressful or emotional, he just does. And they will try to say that they have not proven their case, hold him to the standard, which is the highest in the world.
And Brian, how would you go about closing tomorrow?
I would empower the jury with their visit to the crime scene. I mean, most of the defense's bringing out the reasonable doubt has to do with crime scene recreation, details from the crime scene. If I'm Jim Griffin, I'm saying, listen, you guys are out there. I bring them in. You would have observed this point that we brought to you earlier last week. You would have observed this. Did you look at the door frame pellets? Did you, see XYZ? I would make them part of that, of the defense's perspective. Because, now they've been out there, they would have been observing things that both sides are saying. So I make them mine. Right. To the extent that they were personally there, I would do that. And I'd also be referencing John Marvin. If I'm Jim Griffin, John Marvin was an excellent witness for the defense. He was one of the last witnesses. He personally knows Alex Murdaugh and his relationship. He endeared himself to the jury by being there and cleaning up Paul the next day. Now that the drugs are into play and the drug opioid addiction, he was there taking Alex Murdaugh to rehab. And he made a vow when he was cleaning up the body of his nephew, and he said, I will find your killers, and was allowed to have that moment. And have you found them? No, I have not. I would be John Marvin was just such a normal, credible, and I know he comes from a very prestigious family, generations of Murdaughs, but he was the most normal kind of guy coming from that family that you could put up there. And I'd be referencing his presence in front of that jury. I'd be calling his name out in closing.
And we don't know what that jury is thinking right now, but I will tell you, I did see an online poll today. At last check, 144,000 some odd people had weighed in, and 55% were not saying guilty. 45% said guilty. Really? A certain number of people were waiting until closing arguments. Some others said they simply weren't sure just yet. But out of that 144,000 or so people that I saw today, 45% said guilty. Surprising?
That is surprising, but maybe we've been too much into social media, and the people that typically comment there sometimes are already baked in. I'm surprised by how kind of relatively even that is, because it is a very difficult thing, the task that the jury has to do to put aside all this admitted terrible lying and stealing and then say he is not a murderer. That's very difficult, so I am surprised by that.
All right, tomorrow morning at 9:30, the defense, Jim Griffin, we're thinking, is going to give closing arguments for the defense, and then the state will have their final say right after those closing arguments by the defense team. And then we expect the jury to get the case sometime, perhaps tomorrow afternoon. It's going to be a wait and see as to what happens here. All right. Brian, Luke, Sheely, guys, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
As always, you can follow what's going on by simply logging on to any of our social media platforms, the WLTX Plus page, YouTube page, WLTX.com, and of course, we will be on the air tomorrow morning at 9:30 on WLTX News 19 with the latest from the courtroom. We will air those closing arguments live as they happen. We'll see you then.